This story is a fictional narrative created from speculation, incomplete accounts, and interpretations that were never officially verified. They say the house always felt heavier at night. Not haunted, not threatening, just waited, like the walls were holding their breath. Like certain rooms remembered things the people inside had agreed to forget. The man grew up believing his family was simply fortunate, quietly successful. The kind of wealth that didn't brag, didn't explain itself, didn't need to. Money appeared when it was needed. Doors opened without questions. Problems dissolved before they ever became urgent. That was normal to him, until one night when a single sentence, spoken carelessly, almost kindly, changed the way everything sounded. You know that didn't come from nothing. The words weren't meant as an accusation, more like a reminder. A warning, perhaps, delivered too late. After that, he started noticing the gaps. The way certain topics ended conversations too quickly. The way names were avoided. The way stories about the past shifted subtly, depending on who was telling them. Small inconsistencies brushed aside for years, suddenly aligned into something darker. And then there was the ledger. Not a dramatic discovery. No hidden safe. No secret vault. Just a thin, aging book tucked where no one thought to look anymore. Because no one expected anyone to look at all. The numbers didn't bother him at first. It was the dates that did. They clustered around a period no one ever talked about. A time that existed only as silence in family memory. A time when something had clearly happened, and then been buried under prosperity. As he dug deeper, one truth became impossible to avoid. The wealth didn't begin with success. It began with an absence, someone who vanished from stories, an event that was never named, a crime no one was ever charged for. And the closer he came to understanding it, the more he realized the most dangerous thing about the truth wasn't what it revealed. It was what it demanded next. Every family has a story they repeat, and every family has a story they don't. This one, depending on who tells it, sits in the space between those two, passed down not through words, but through comfort, through the quiet assurance that problems will always be handled, that consequences will always land somewhere else. The man had never questioned it. Why would he? From the inside, privilege feels like gravity. Invisible, reliable, always there. But gravity can also hide what's buried beneath it. They say his family spoke often about values, hard work, sacrifice, responsibility. They said these things with the confidence of people who believed them, or needed to. What they didn't say was how the foundation was laid, how the first leap forward required someone else to fall. If you're drawn to stories like this, stories about what happens when loyalty collides with truth, subscribe to the channel. These are the crimes that don't happen in the dark. They happen in dining rooms, offices, inheritances. And while you're here, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Distance has a way of changing how close these stories feel. Because what this man uncovered wasn't just a secret. It was a structure. A carefully maintained silence that spanned generations. One that rewarded obedience and punished curiosity. Not with violence, but with exclusion. And as he followed the trail backward, he began to understand something unsettling. No one in his family believed they were criminals. They believed they were survivors. And that belief had shaped everything. The first lie he believed was that nothing was missing. He grew up surrounded by abundance, but never excess. The family valued discretion. No flashy displays, no careless talk. Wealth, he was taught, was something you protected by not attracting attention to it. That lesson came early. So did another quieter one. Certain questions were unnecessary. When he asked about how the family business truly began, the answers were always vague, but confident. Right place, right time. A risk that paid off. Someone had to be brave. Brave was the word they liked most. It sounded clean. As he got older, he noticed how often bravery was used to smooth over discomfort. How it replaced details. How it shut doors gently but firmly. The ledger came into his hands by accident. At least, that's how it felt. He had been sorting through old documents. Nothing urgent, nothing suspicious. Just years of accumulated paper that no one wanted to deal with anymore. The kind of task families postpone indefinitely because it threatens nostalgia. The book was thin, unassuming, no label, no significance attached to it anymore. But the entries were meticulous. Dates, amounts, transfers that didn't align with the official story of growth. Money appearing abruptly, then stabilizing into permanence. The pattern bothered him, not because it suggested wrongdoing outright, but because it suggested interruption, a sudden change in trajectory that didn't match the narrative he'd been given. When he asked about it casually, the reaction was immediate. Not anger. Stillness. The conversation paused in a way that felt practiced. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else changed the subject too quickly. That was the moment he understood something important. The silence wasn't accidental. It was enforced through habit. Later, he noticed other things. Old photos removed from frame, gaps where names should have been, stories that ended abruptly before reaching certain years. He began mapping timelines. Not obsessively, carefully, and what emerged was a void. A period of time that existed everywhere in records, and nowhere in memory. When he finally confronted one of the older relatives, the response wasn't denial. It was exhaustion. That was a long time ago, they said. And it's over. Over for who? He asked. The question wasn't answered. Instead, he was warned. Not threatened. Warned. Some truths, they told him, cost more than they give back. That sentence echoed in his mind long after the conversation ended, because he was starting to realize the wealth hadn't simply been inherited. It had been preserved. Through silence. Through alignment. Through an agreement, never written down, never spoken clearly, that the past would remain unexamined. And the deeper he looked, the clearer it became that this agreement had a price. Not paid all at once, paid slowly. By everyone who came after. The warning stayed with him longer than the conversation itself. Some truths cost more than they give back. It wasn't said with menace. There was no raised voice, no ultimatum. That was what made it effective. It sounded like advice passed down through experience, like something the family had learned the hard way and survived by obeying. But survival, he was beginning to understand, wasn't the same as innocence. He didn't push immediately. That would have broken the rhythm. Families like his didn't respond to pressure. They responded to patience, to quiet persistence that didn't announce itself as rebellion. So he listened. At dinners, he paid attention to what wasn't said, to the way conversations curved away from certain years, certain people, to how laughter arrived a beat too late, when old anecdotes brushed too close to forbidden ground. The absence had shape now. And once you notice the shape of a thing, you start seeing its outline everywhere. He went back to the ledger. This time, he didn't read it as a financial record. He read it as a timeline. He compared entries to family milestones, births, moves, expansions. The numbers didn't just appear. They replaced something. There was a transfer that stood out. Not large by later standards, but sudden, final. After it, the family's trajectory changed permanently. Before it, the records were inconsistent. After it, they were disciplined, structured, confident. Whatever happened during that gap hadn't just provided money. It had provided certainty. That realization unsettled him more than the possibility of a crime, because certainty is what allows people to stop asking questions. He began searching for names, not online, not officially, but through old correspondence, letters, margins, handwritten notes that assumed the reader already knew the context. One name appeared once, then never again. It wasn't crossed out. It wasn't emphasized. It simply ended. He asked about it. This time, the response was sharper. "Why are you doing this?" Someone asked him, not angrily, honestly. He didn't have a clean answer. Because curiosity wasn't the whole truth anymore. Something else had taken hold. A sense that he was living inside the benefits of something unresolved. That comfort had been purchased, and someone else had paid. The older relatives spoke less around him after that. Not openly hostile, just cautious. As if he'd become unpredictable. He noticed how often they framed the past as dangerous terrain. People got hurt back then. It wasn't a safe time. Everyone did what they had to do. Those phrases repeated with slight variations, like a script worn thin by repetition. Everyone did what they had to do. That sentence became a fault line, because it implied inevitability, as if choice had never existed. But the ledger suggested otherwise. The money didn't arrive slowly. It arrived decisively, which meant someone had chosen a moment, chosen an outcome, and chosen silence afterward. He finally asked the question no one wanted to hear, phrased plainly. Who lost something so we could gain this? The room went still again, longer this time. Then someone said, "No one lost. That's not fair." "Then what happened?" he asked. Another pause. "Something was taken," they admitted, "but it wasn't us who took it." That distinction mattered deeply to them. It mattered less to him, because whether the family had acted directly or simply benefited from the aftermath, the result was the same. They had accepted it. They had built lives on it, and they had raised their children to never ask where it came from. Later that night, alone, he returned to the house's oldest room, the one no one used anymore, preserved more by neglect than intention. He looked at the walls differently now, at the furniture, at the air itself. He wondered how many people before him had felt the same unease and chosen comfort instead. How many had sensed the weight and learned to carry it without complaint. The thought that unsettled him most wasn't that his family had done something wrong. It was that they believed the wrongdoing had ended. That time had neutralized it. That silence had resolved it. But silence doesn't resolve anything. It just teaches people how to live around the problem. And as he closed the ledger and placed it back where he'd found it, one truth settled in with uncomfortable clarity. The crime wasn't just what had happened years ago. The crime was what had continued happening every day since. Through inheritance, through gratitude, through the unspoken agreement that some questions were too expensive to ask. And now that he had asked them, he wasn't sure whether the cost would be paid by him or by everyone else. The next morning, the house behaved like nothing had happened. Coffee was poured. Doors opened softly. Schedules continued. Someone asked him about a meeting he had later in the week, as if the ledger hadn't rearranged his entire understanding of the family. That normalcy wasn't comfort. It was pressure. It said, "Return to your place." He tried. He really did. But every familiar detail now felt staged. The quiet confidence in the way his relatives moved through the house. The way bills and problems never seemed to reach them. The way they spoke about family like it was a shield rather than a relationship. He watched his father, if it was his father in the version you're hearing, wipe down a countertop that was already clean. A small repetitive action performed with the kind of focus people use when they are avoiding something larger. He realized then that the family didn't just share wealth. They shared maintenance. Each person had a role in keeping the silence intact, and they performed it automatically, not because someone forced them, but because disruption threatened the structure that held them up. He decided to test something. Not aggressively, not dramatically. He told a story at breakfast about a colleague who had discovered financial wrongdoing in his own company. The colleague had reported it. The company had retaliated. The colleague had lost his job. He presented it as gossip, as casual conversation. Then he watched their faces. No one responded with outrage. No one asked, "Was the colleague okay?" Instead, they focused on the same point. Every time. "Why would he do that?" one relative asked. "Why would he bring that kind of attention?" Another said, "He should have thought of his future." A third offered, "Sometimes it's better to let sleeping things sleep." Sleeping things. That phrase chilled him more than he expected, because sleeping things eventually wake. He asked gently, "But if something is wrong, doesn't it matter?" A pause. Then someone answered with a softness that felt rehearsed. "What matters is what you can live with." He nodded as if he agreed. But inside, something hardened. Because he was starting to see how morality had been rewritten in this family, not as right and wrong, but as survivable and unspeakable. Later, he approached the only person he trusted enough to risk honesty with. His mother, his aunt, a sibling, depending on the version. Someone who still had the habit of being human around him. He didn't show the ledger. He didn't name the gap. He simply asked, Do you ever feel like we're standing on something that isn't solid? The person looked at him for a long time, then said quietly, "Where did you find it?" That was his answer. They knew. They had always known something. Maybe not details, but shape, weight, the outline of absence. They had felt it and learned to live around it, just like everyone else. "I didn't mean to," he said. "I wasn't trying to dig." The person's eyes softened, not with comfort, but with fatigue. "Of course you were," they said. "Everyone who notices it eventually tries. They just stop." "Why?" Another pause, then the most honest sentence he'd heard in days. "Because you can't unbuild what it built," they whispered. The phrase landed like a verdict. He stared at them. "So that's it. We just accept it." "Not accept," they corrected. "Manage. Manage. Not repent. Not repair. Not confess. Manage." They told him in fragments what they could. That there had been a person once. A partner. A neighbor. A distant relative. Someone who had been close enough to matter, then suddenly became unmentionable. The family claimed the person had left, disappeared, gone their own way, but the language used to describe it was too careful. People who leave are described with sadness, anger, betrayal. This person was described with emptiness, like a space that couldn't be touched. He asked, "Was there ever any accountability?" The person looked away. "No one was charged," they said. "That's the whole reason it worked." Worked! As if the lack of charges wasn't a failure of justice, but a feature of the design. He felt his stomach tighten. So what actually happened? He pressed, and that was when the person finally set a boundary. "I can't," they said. "Not because I don't want to, because I don't know what becomes real if I say it." He sat with that. He understood suddenly that the family's silence wasn't just secrecy, it was superstition. As if naming the crime might summon consequences that had been held back by omission alone. That evening, he opened the ledger again and traced the same entries with his finger, as if touch could reveal what language refused. Then he noticed something he hadn't the first time. A note, small, cramped, written in the margin beside the transfer that changed everything. Not a name, not a place. A word. Settled. His breath caught. Settled wasn't neutral. Settled meant an agreement. A conclusion reached without public truth. A transaction that replaced accountability with closure. And the worst part was what that word implied. Someone had accepted settlement instead of justice. Someone had traded silence for survival. And his family had built a life on the profit of that trade. The word settled changed how he slept. It followed him into the quiet hours, repeating itself with a calm that felt rehearsed. Settlements were supposed to be endings, clean lines drawn under messes too complicated to address directly. But this one didn't feel clean. It felt compressed, like something folded tightly enough to pass inspection. He began to notice how often his family used similar language. Handled, resolved, put to rest. None of those words described truth. They described containment. At dinner that night, he listened more than he spoke. The conversation skimmed across safe topics, travel plans that never included specifics, investments discussed without origin stories, anecdotes that praised cleverness without naming risk. He realized something uncomfortable. He had been praised like this before. For being careful, for knowing when not to ask, for understanding how things work. The compliments felt different now. They felt instructional. Later, he brought the ledger to his room and compared it to other documents he found scattered through old files. Contracts without context. Letters that referenced agreements without naming what was agreed upon. Handwritten notes that ended with phrases like "as discussed" and "we're aligned." Align. The language of cooperation without transparency. He tried to imagine the moment when the settlement had been accepted. Who had sat across from whom? What had been said? And what had been left unsaid? Whether anyone had believed the silence would be temporary, or whether they'd known it would become permanent. He finally asked the question that had been circling his thoughts for days. Who signed? He didn't ask it out loud. He asked it by observing. He watched who flinched when certain years were mentioned, who corrected timelines unnecessarily, who used humor to divert attention. Patterns emerged, not pointing to a single person, but to a small cluster. an inner ring who had inherited not just wealth, but authorship. One evening, he confronted one of them privately, not aggressively, carefully. "I found something," he said, "and I don't think it belongs to me alone." The person didn't ask what. They sighed. "You always did notice things," they said, with a tired half-smile. "That used to worry us." "Worry you how?" he asked. "That you'd confuse truth with usefulness." The sentence landed harder than he expected. "Are you saying the truth wasn't useful?" he asked. "I'm saying it was unaffordable," they replied. The explanation came in fragments, not a confession, more like a controlled release of pressure. There had been a dispute. Serious, complicated, the kind that threatens to expose more than one person if it goes public. There were claims, counterclaims, and a growing fear that once spoken aloud, the story would take on a life of its own. "So you settled," he said. The person nodded. "And in doing so, we prevented something worse." "Worse for who?" Another pause. "For everyone," they said without conviction. He noticed the shift. The language had moved from certainty to defense. "What happened to the person?" he asked. "They were compensated." "Compensated for what?" The person looked away. "For loss." "What loss?" "Silence." That was the moment he understood the rule. You could talk around the crime. You could describe its effects. You could justify its outcome, but you could never name it, because naming would collapse the careful distinction they relied on, that no one had been charged. Therefore, no one had done anything wrong. He pushed once more. "Do you think we deserved what we built from that?" he asked. The person's voice hardened slightly. "Deserve doesn't apply to families. Survival does. Survival. Always survival." He left the conversation feeling colder than before, not because of what he'd learned, because of what he hadn't. No one was innocent in the way he'd hoped. But no one was monstrous either. They were ordinary people who had made a collective decision to trade truth for stability, and then taught their children to mistake the result for merit. He looked at his life differently after that, at his education, at his access. At the moments, doors opened without explanation. He hadn't stolen anything with his own hands. But he had benefited with every step, and benefit, he realized, carries its own form of responsibility. The crime hadn't ended with the settlement. It had been amortized, spread across years, across people, across generations. That night he wrote a list, not of evidence, of choices. Every moment where he could continue as before. Every moment where he could say nothing and remain safe. And every moment where speaking might fracture the only structure he'd ever known. The list wasn't balanced. Silence was easier, safer, more familiar. But familiarity, he now understood, was part of the trap. As he folded the list and placed it inside the ledger, he made a decision he didn't announce. He wouldn't expose the family publicly. Not yet. But he wouldn't protect the silence either. There were other ways to let consequences arrive. Slower ways. Ways that didn't rely on charges or trials or names being dragged into light. Ways that required patience and distance. The crime had been settled once. But settlement, he was learning, doesn't end a story. It only delays the chapter where someone finally decides what they can live with and what they can't. Knowledge changed his posture before it changed his plans. He noticed it in small ways, the way he no longer leaned comfortably into family conversations, the way laughter felt borrowed instead of shared, the way every familiar space now carried an extra layer, an awareness of what had been paid for and by whom. Nothing external forced this shift. No confrontations, no accusations, no dramatic break, just the quiet erosion of belonging. He began declining invitations. Not abruptly, gradually, a scheduling conflict here, fatigue there. The family interpreted it as independence, even maturity. They were proud of him for stepping into his own life. That pride made him uncomfortable, because it meant they believed the system was working. Distance gave him clarity. Away from the house, away from inherited routines, he started to see how deeply the family's logic had shaped him, not just morally, but practically. He was efficient, risk-averse, skilled at identifying which truths were safe to speak and which ones needed careful handling. Those skills hadn't come from nowhere. They were the byproduct of growing up inside a structure built on containment. He wondered how many of his decisions, career choices, relationships, even friendships, had been influenced by an instinct to preserve stability at all costs. How often he'd chosen the option that avoided friction without realizing why. The thought unsettled him, because it suggested the crime hadn't just funded his life. It had trained him. He began revisiting old family stories with new ears. The tales of sacrifice that now sounded like rationalization. The praise of loyalty that felt conditional. The warnings about outsiders that carried more fear than wisdom. And always, beneath it all, the same assumption. That exposure was more dangerous than wrongdoing. One evening, he met with someone who knew the family only peripherally. An old friend, a colleague, someone far enough removed to be unaffected by the internal gravity. They spoke casually at first. Then, without planning to, he tested a boundary. He told a sanitized version of the story. No names, no accusations, just the outline. Inherited wealth, an unresolved crime. A settlement instead of accountability. The reaction surprised him. The person didn't recoil, didn't moralize, didn't rush to advice. They simply said, "That sounds heavy, not shocking, not unbelievable, heavy." That word mattered. Because heaviness implies weight carried over time, not spectacle. He realized then how distorted his frame of reference had become. Inside his family, silence was normalized. Outside it, silence was recognized for what it was. A burden. That conversation marked a turning point. Not because it gave him answers, but because it showed him he wasn't trapped inside a single moral universe. Other frameworks existed. Frameworks where accountability wasn't seen as destruction. Where truth didn't automatically mean collapse. Where families survived rupture rather than dissolving under it. Back home, the tension sharpened. The family sensed his distance even if they didn't name it. Questions grew more pointed. "Are you unhappy? Did we do something? You know you can talk to us." He listened to those offers carefully. They weren't invitations to honesty. They were invitations to rejoin the agreement. To speak, but only within approved limits. He realized something else then. The family didn't fear exposure anymore. They feared fracture. The wealth was stable. The past distant. No one was coming to charge anyone. The danger now wasn't legal. It was relational. What terrified them was the possibility that someone might refuse to carry the silence forward. Because silence only works if everyone participates. One night, while sorting through documents he hadn't meant to revisit again, he found something new. Not evidence, not a confession. A letter. It wasn't addressed to him. It had never been meant for him, but it had been kept. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The tone wasn't. It was restrained, careful, polite, and deeply resigned. The writer didn't accuse, didn't beg, didn't threaten. They acknowledged the settlement, accepted the terms, agreed to disappear from the narrative. But near the end, one line stood out. "I understand this is the price of moving on. I hope it buys you peace." The sentence hit him harder than any accusation could have, because it implied consent without justice, acceptance without closure, and a hope, quiet, almost generous, that the people who benefited might at least feel peace. He folded the letter slowly. That hope hadn't been fulfilled. The family wasn't peaceful. They were vigilant, guarding something unresolved and calling it stability. That night, he stopped thinking in terms of revelation. He started thinking in terms of refusal, not dramatic exposure, not public reckoning, just refusal. Refusal to keep benefiting quietly. Refusal to repeat the language of survival. Refusal to let the crime remain abstract. He didn't know yet what that would look like, only that whatever came next would cost him something, and that for the first time in his life, the cost felt honest. The family noticed the shift before they understood it. Not because he announced anything, but because the usual signals stopped working. Silence no longer pulled him back in. Subtle warnings no longer redirected him. The careful emotional gravity that had kept everyone aligned began to lose its hold. He wasn't confrontational. That was what confused them. He didn't accuse anyone, didn't threaten exposure, didn't even raise his voice. He simply began opting out of certain rituals, declining opportunities that relied on family connections, redirecting conversations that framed the past as heroic, refusing favors that came with unspoken expectations. Each refusal was small. Together they felt destabilized. Someone finally asked him, not unkindly, "Are you trying to punish us?" He answered honestly, "No, I'm trying to stop pretending." That sentence spread faster than he expected. It wasn't inflammatory, but it was disruptive. It suggested that pretending had been a shared activity, a choice, not a necessity. The older relatives responded with concern, framed as care. "You're carrying something heavy," they said. "You don't have to do this alone. There's no benefit in reopening wounds." He listened. He always listened. But he noticed how often their concerns circled back to the same outcome. Let things remain as they are. They weren't afraid of consequences. They were afraid of movement. The first real break came quietly. He turned down a role that would have cemented his position within the family's network, an opportunity designed to keep him close, invested, grateful. Declining it required no explanation. But the absence of acceptance sent a message louder than refusal ever could. That night, he received a call. The voice on the other end was controlled, measured, and unmistakably serious. "You're creating risk," they said. "Risk to what?" he asked. "To all of us." He waited. "To the story," they clarified. "To the understanding that's kept this family intact." He realized then that the crime itself was no longer the center of the structure. The story was. As long as everyone agreed on what had happened, or more accurately, what hadn't, the family remained cohesive. Once that agreement fractured, the crime resurfaced, not as a legal issue, but as a moral one. "You don't have to like it," the voice continued. "You just have to live inside it." That was the moment he understood something crucial. They didn't expect obedience. They expected inevitability. The belief that eventually comfort would outweigh conscience. He ended the call politely. Then he did something that felt both insignificant and irreversible. He changed his will. Not publicly, not dramatically, just a quiet reallocation. Funds that would have flowed back into the family's ecosystem were redirected outward, to causes unrelated, unbranded, unattributed. It wasn't restitution. It was interruption. The money still existed, but it no longer reinforced the silence. When this became known, the reaction was swift. Not rage. Fear. "You're destabilizing things," someone told him. "You're making it visible," said another. Visible was the word they feared most, because visibility didn't require accusations. It didn't need proof. It simply changed how people looked at what had once seemed solid. He wasn't exposing the crime. He was refusing to launder it forward. And that refusal carried a cost. Invitations stopped. Conversations cooled. Support became conditional again. Not hostile, just withdrawn. The family wasn't punishing him. They were protecting themselves. He felt the loss more sharply than he expected. Not of money, of belonging, because despite everything, these were the people who had raised him, loved him in their way, given him comfort and safety and a sense of place. Walking away from the silence meant walking away from that too. Some nights he doubted himself. He wondered if he was being rigid, self-righteous, if the harm of disruption outweighed the good of truth withheld. But then he remembered the letter. "I hope it buys you peace." The peace hadn't arrived, only maintenance. And maintenance, he now understood, was not the same as healing. The final realization came slowly, then all at once. The crime had never required him to act. It required him to continue. By choosing not to, he wasn't correcting the past. He was changing the future. The family would go on. They always would. Wealth adapts. Stories evolve. Silence finds new carriers. But he would not be one of them. And that choice, quiet, costly, and incomplete, felt like the first honest inheritance he had ever claimed. The consequences didn't arrive like punishment. They arrived like seepage. At first, nothing obvious changed. No public reckoning, no sudden loss of status. The family's name still opened doors. Their reputation remained intact. From the outside, the structure looked as solid as ever. But structures built on silence don't collapse all at once. They leak. It started with small inconveniences, things no one could accuse anyone of causing, a partnership that cooled unexpectedly, a deal that stalled without explanation, a favor that took longer to materialize than it used to. No one blamed him directly. That was the rule. Blame would have required acknowledgement. Instead, the family spoke in euphemisms. Times are different. People are more cautious now. Nothing lasts forever. But he noticed the shift in tone when his name came up. A subtle pause. A recalibration, as if people were deciding how much of him could still be trusted. Trust, he realized, wasn't about honesty. It was about predictability. And he had made himself unpredictable. Outside the family, his life grew simpler and harder. Opportunities that once came easily now required explanation. Connections he'd taken for granted became distant, unsure whether aligning with him still made sense. He welcomed that discomfort more than he expected. For the first time, progress felt earned rather than inherited. But the cost was real. He lost access, lost insulation, lost the quiet advantages that had smoothed over mistakes and softened consequences. And in losing them, he saw how much they had mattered. He began noticing stories that mirrored his own. Not in details, but in shape. Families that prospered after someone else disappeared from the narrative. Wealth that arrived cleanly, only after something messy had been buried. These stories rarely ended with justice. They ended with normalization. People adapted, benefited, forgot. Until someone didn't. He didn't tell his story publicly. He didn't need to. His refusal alone was enough to create friction. Enough to remind people that silence wasn't neutral. It was active. One afternoon, he was approached by someone who knew the family history only in outline. A business associate. A distant connection. They spoke carefully, as people do when circling something sensitive. "I heard you stepped away," the person said, "from certain arrangements." He didn't correct the vagueness. "Yes," he said. The person hesitated. "That can be complicated." "It already was," he replied. The conversation ended there, but the look lingered. Not suspicion, recognition, as if the person had seen this pattern before. He began to understand that crimes like the one embedded in his family rarely stayed contained. They diffused outward through relationships, institutions, networks. Each person who benefited became another layer of insulation between the act and its consequences. By stepping out, he hadn't exposed the crime. He'd thinned the insulation, and that thinning changed how the system behaved. People became more cautious about invoking the family's name, more careful about relying on their quiet influence. Not because they knew the truth, but because the story felt less stable than it once had. Stability, it turned out, depended on unanimity. And unanimity had cracked. The family responded by tightening internally. More meetings, more emphasis on unity, more reminders of what they'd built together. They spoke often now of legacy. Legacy was a comforting word. It suggested continuity without scrutiny. He declined invitations to those discussions, not out of spite, but because he understood what they were asking. They wanted him back inside the circle, back inside the silence. One evening, a relative confronted him directly. "You think you're better than us now?" they asked. He shook his head. "No. I think I'm more honest about what I'm part of." "That's the same thing," the relative said. He didn't argue, because for people who've lived comfortably inside a moral compromise, honesty does feel like judgment. The hardest part wasn't the conflict. It was the loneliness. Stepping away didn't come with a new community ready to receive him. It came with space, with uncertainty, with the knowledge that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee belonging elsewhere. But that space also allowed something new, perspective. He began seeing his family not as villains or victims, but as participants in a system that rewarded silence and punished disruption, a system older than any single person, stronger than individual intent. And he saw his own role clearly now. He wasn't the hero. He was the leak, the slow, inconvenient reminder that what had been settled was never truly resolved, and that some structures don't need to be torn down to be changed. They only need someone to stop holding them together. Distance did what confrontation never could. It exposed the fault lines without striking them. As weeks passed, the family adjusted to his absence the way they adjusted to everything else, by redistributing responsibility. Others stepped into the spaces he'd vacated. Roles were reassigned. Conversations rerouted. The structure compensated. But compensation isn't repair. It's strain management. He noticed the strain in small human ways. A relative who suddenly spoke too carefully, as if every sentence needed approval. Another who began reaching out more often, not for closeness, but for reassurance that nothing was truly wrong. Someone else who grew defensive without provocation. The silence was no longer effortless. It required work. Outside the family, the effects became clearer. A project he'd been associated with lost momentum. A partnership dissolved quietly. No accusations, no fallout. Just a slow cooling that left everyone pretending it had been mutual. He learned to live with that ambiguity. What surprised him was how often people asked why without asking, what? Why would you walk away? Why make things harder? Why not let it be? They didn't ask what had happened, or who had been harmed, or whether the benefits were worth the cost. They asked why he refused comfort. That question revealed more than any ledger ever had, because it assumed comfort was the goal. One night, sorting through old messages he'd ignored during the transition, he found a note from someone he barely remembered, an acquaintance from years earlier. The message was brief, awkward, hesitant. I heard you stepped back from your family's network. I don't know the details, but thank you. It matters to see someone do that. He stared at the words longer than he expected, not because they validated him, because they suggested he wasn't alone in noticing. He realized then that the family's silence had never been self-contained. It had signaled to others what was acceptable, what could be smoothed over, what kind of outcomes were rewarded. By stepping out, he hadn't just disrupted an internal agreement. He'd interrupted a signal. And interruptions propagate. The family felt it too. They began reframing his absence publicly, not as dissent, but as choice. Different priorities, a desire for independence, a new chapter. Language mattered. They weren't lying. They were editing. He recognized the tactic because he'd once used it himself. Then came the invitation. Not to return, to negotiate. A small gathering. Private. Carefully chosen attendee. The tone was conciliatory, almost warm. We don't want this to become something it doesn't need to be, someone said. What does it need to be? He asked. A family matter, they replied. Handled internally. Handled. There it was again. He listened as they offered compromises that weren't compromises at all. Increased autonomy. Symbolic gestures. Distance without disavowal. All designed to keep the core intact while easing the pressure. They weren't asking him to lie. They were asking him to resume participating. I'm not trying to damage anything, he said calmly. I'm just not willing to carry it anymore. Someone sighed. You're making it heavier for everyone else. He nodded. I know. That was the truth they hadn't expected him to accept. Because weight, once redistributed, feels unfair to those who've grown accustomed to not noticing it. The meeting ended without resolution. Not hostile. Incomplete. Afterward, he walked alone for a long time. He felt the familiar tug of doubt, the question of whether distance was enough, whether refusal without articulation could truly change anything, whether he was merely protecting himself while others remained inside the structure he'd helped destabilize. He didn't want to become righteous. He didn't want to become cruel. He wanted to become accurate. Accuracy, he'd learned, wasn't about telling everything. It was about not pretending any. He decided then on his final boundary. He wouldn't tell the story publicly, but he also wouldn't correct it when it drifted. If someone assumed the family's success was earned cleanly, he wouldn't confirm it. If someone hinted at complexity, he wouldn't soften it. He would let ambiguity stand where certainty had once been enforced. It was a small thing. But small things had started this. Over time, the family story lost its crispness. It became less useful, less portable, less able to open doors without explanation. No one accused anyone. No one was charged, and yet something shifted. The crime remained unspoken, but it no longer traveled as easily. That, he realized, was the limit he needed to cross. Not exposure, not redemption, just non-cooperation. Because some systems don't collapse under pressure. They erode when people stop reinforcing them. And erosion, unlike confrontation, doesn't ask permission. It just continues. There comes a point when distance stops feeling like progress. For him, it arrived quietly, without drama, without pressure from the family, without any new discovery, just a persistent sense that something unfinished was still moving beneath the surface, unchanged by his refusal to participate. He had stepped away. He had interrupted the flow. He had paid a personal price. And yet, the core remained intact. The crime was still unnamed. The person who had accepted settlement still existed only as an absence. The wealth still circulated, cleaner with every generation that touched it, without asking. He understood then that non-cooperation had limits. It slowed erosion, but it didn't resolve the fracture. The family had adapted. They always did. They had reframed his absence into a narrative that preserved dignity on all sides. A story of divergence, not dissent. Independence, not refusal. From the outside, it worked. That was the problem. He began thinking less about guilt and more about inheritance. Not money, but consequence. About how silence doesn't just protect those who agree to it. It transfers its burden forward, quietly, until someone eventually carries it without ever consenting to. That someone, he realized, had been him, and unless something changed, it would be someone else next. A niece, a nephew, a future child raised inside a structure that mistook comfort for virtue. The thought disturbed him more than the loss of belonging ever had. He revisited the letter again, the one written by the person who had accepted settlement. The handwriting still careful, the tone still restrained, the final line still devastating in its generosity. I hope it buys you peace. It hadn't, and the longer peace failed to arrive, the clearer the obligation became. Not legal, not public, personal. He didn't owe the family silence anymore, but he owed the truth. Somewhere, a refusal to vanish completely. The question was where and how. He considered many possibilities and rejected them all. Public exposure would turn the story into spectacle. Private confrontation had already proven insufficient. Moral gestures, however sincere, could be absorbed and neutralized. He needed something quieter, something that couldn't be managed. The idea came to him not as inspiration, but as inevitability. He would tell the story, but without names, without accusation, without a demand for action. He would document it, not as evidence, as memory, a record that refused erasure. Not shared widely, not promoted, simply placed where it could be found by someone who might one day need it, someone who might notice the same gaps he had, someone who would wonder why certain years never came up. He understood the risk immediately. This wouldn't expose the family legally, but it would end the guarantee of silence. Once written, the story could outlive him, outlast their control, resist their edits. It wouldn't accuse anyone directly, but it would remove the family's greatest protection. The ability to say nothing happened because something would have been remembered. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. He wrote slowly, carefully, without emotion that could be dismissed as bitterness, without certainty that could be challenged. He used language of ambiguity, the same language the family had used for decades, but inverted. There are versions that suggest, some believe, it said that a settlement replaced something that was never resolved. He described the absence, not the act. The benefit, not the crime. The silence, not the event. Anyone reading it would understand what he meant. Anyone denying it would have to work harder than before. When he finished, he didn't feel relief. He felt gravity, because this was different from refusal. This was continuation, with direction. He stored the document somewhere unremarkable, somewhere neither secret nor visible, the kind of place that survives transitions. He didn't feel heroic. He felt exposed and strangely calm. That night, For the first time since he'd discovered the ledger, he slept without replaying conversation, without rehearsing defenses, without imagining arguments that would never happen. The debt, he realized, hadn't been erased, but it had stopped moving forward. And that, quiet, incomplete, irreversible, was enough to change what came next. Silence doesn't break the way people expect. It doesn't shatter. It thins. At first, nothing happened after he finished the document. No confrontation, no sudden messages, no indication that anyone else had noticed the shift he'd introduced. That, too, felt familiar. Silence had always relied on the assumption that nothing visible meant nothing was wrong. But weeks later, subtle signs began to surface. Not reaction, ripples. A relative asked him cautiously whether he'd been writing things down lately. The question was framed casually, but the intent was unmistakable. Someone had sensed movement where there shouldn't have been any. He answered honestly. Yes. There was a pause. What kind of things? Things I don't want to forget, he said. The conversation didn't continue, and yet, something had changed. The family grew more careful in ways they hadn't before. Not just around him, around each other. Stories that had once been told loosely were now edited mid-sentence. Certain phrases were retired. References to the past became even more abstract. The silence had tightened, which meant it was no longer effortless. That was the difference. Effort invites fatigue, and fatigue invites mistakes. He didn't wait for those mistakes. He didn't need to, because the document didn't exist to be read immediately. It existed to outlast intention, to survive reorganizations, inheritances, transitions of power. It didn't accuse anyone. It didn't demand justice. It simply ensured that the crime, whatever its precise nature, could no longer pretend it had never been considered. Someone, somewhere, had noticed. And once noticed, silence becomes a choice rather than a default. He understood then why the family feared visibility more than exposure. Exposure can be denied. Visibility lingers. Months later, he heard indirectly that a younger member of the family had started asking questions. Not aggressive ones. The same careful questions he'd once asked. Why that year never came up. Why certain names weren't used anymore. Why wealth seemed to arrive all at once instead of gradually. The questions were deflected. But they existed, and that alone meant the debt was no longer transferring cleanly. He never confirmed the existence of the document. Never hinted at its location. Never claimed authorship. If someone found it one day, it would stand on its own. Ambiguous, incomplete, undeniable in its implications. That restraint mattered, because it prevented the story from becoming his. It remained what it had always been, a family crime without a charge, without a trial, without closure. But now, not without memory, the family continued on. They adapted. They always would. Wealth doesn't dissolve because of discomfort. Structures survive longer than conscience. But the confidence that once surrounded them began to thin. Doors didn't open quite as smoothly. Assumptions required explanation. Silence required reinforcement. And reinforcement costs energy. He felt no triumph watching this unfold. Only a quiet certainty that something irreversible had been done. Not justice, not repair. Orientation. He had changed the direction of the silence. Instead of flowing forward unchallenged, it now pooled, collected, pressed inward. And pressure, left long enough, reveals shape. Years later, according to some versions, someone outside the family would stumble upon the document. Not seeking scandal, not hunting secrets, just trying to understand why something felt unfinished. What they found wouldn't be proof, but it would be enough. Enough to ask better questions. Enough to hesitate before repeating the old story. Enough to understand that comfort can be inherited, and so can its cost. As for him, he lived the rest of his life without resolution. No confession, no absolution, no dramatic reckoning, but also without pretense. He accepted that he hadn't corrected the past. He had prevented its clean continuation. And that, he understood, was sometimes the only form of accountability available when crimes are absorbed instead of punished. The family would never thank him. They might never forgive him, but somewhere in the quiet future, someone would know that the silence hadn't gone unquestioned, that it had been noticed, and that someone once had refused to let it pass untouched. Some crimes end with charges. This one ended with inheritance. Not of money, but of silence. A silence so well maintained that it passed for normal, for success, for stability, until one person noticed that what had been settled was never the same as what had been resolved. This story isn't about exposure. It's about interruption, about the moment someone stops reinforcing a lie, not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. The man didn't dismantle his family. He didn't redeem the past. He didn't restore what was taken. What he did was smaller and harder. He refused to let the crime disappear completely. He left a memory where there had only been absence, and in doing so, he changed what the silence could do next, because silence only protects as long as it goes unquestioned, as long as no one remembers choosing it, as long as no one notices the cost being passed forward. Once that changes, the crime doesn't vanish, but it can no longer pretend it never happened. And sometimes, in families like this, that is the only justice that ever arrives. Not punishment, not closure, just the end of forgetting.